Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining me as we have a look through two more exam English questions. We're going to have a look at an FCE open-close exam question, and we're going to have a look at CAE open-close exam questions for you who are feeling brave enough. Now, as usual at the beginning, if you could be so kind as to let me know if you can hear me. I've got my settings set up correctly, I hope. So hopefully you will be able to, but it would be nice if someone was just to say, "Hi Simon, we can hear you," then that would be fantastic. I would know that I'm not just talking to myself like I normally do. Okay, and as always, if I'm looking left and right, I'm not ignoring you. I'm looking at two screens working, so I'm looking at information on both screens at the same time. Now, before we begin, there's just one or two thank yous, as always. First of all, to Flojo, fantastic website. I recommend that you fully utilize Flojo. Lots and lots of materials on there, and I'm a big fan of their resources. And also to all of the Facebook sites that allow me to post on their sites to let everyone know what I'm doing this afternoon. So Cambridge Advanced English, CAE, Matura 2019 z angielskiego, podstawy rozszerzone bez spinki, Matura 2019 polski, matematyka, angielski i inne przedmioty, and I am an FCE student, Cambridge First Certificate in English, and of course the people who follow my page on Facebook as well. Okay, so with that all being said, let's get straight to it and work our way through the FCE exam question. Now, as always, the first exam tip, this article is about exam tips, but the first exam tip for this is always to read through the exercise first. Don't just come to the first question and do the first question. You have to read through the whole exercise first because it gives you an idea of context. First of all, context of what the article is all about. But secondly, context as regards who's involved, how they're involved, what the relationships are, and so on, because this is also an important part of understanding a text. It's not just a bunch of words on a piece of paper. There are relationships between words, there are relationships between people, and in this particular case, the relationship, if we can say that, is between the author and you. And that is important because you as a subject comes up as an answer a couple of times in this exam question. The second piece of exam advice that I'll give you is one to do with structure. Of course, you've got to make sure you know your basic elements of grammar. So you've got to know your tenses, you've got to know relative pronouns and relative clauses, you've got to know how they work. Conditional clauses, also good. If you had a wider knowledge of subclauses and main clauses, that would be fantastic. You're going to see things like substitution in these exams at FCE level, and perhaps a little bit more at CAE level as well. And you're going to see you're going to have lots of knowledge about conjunctions, subordinate conjunctions, linkers, expressions, and so on. So this exam question is a real challenge, and when I was teaching in language schools, this particular question at FCE and CAE was one of the most hated questions because it was one of the hardest questions, because it really tested your whole knowledge of English in terms of structure, in terms of grammar, in terms of your vocabulary as well. So this, if you manage to get, there's 8 questions in this question, and I always said if you manage to get 5 out of 8, that was a pretty good result. And anything you get over 5 out of 8 is a bonus. So of course we're aiming for 8 out of 8, but if you're looking for a target, then for this question, because it's one of the harder questions, if you give yourself the target of 5 out of 8, and you get that, you're doing quite well. Okay, so let's have a look at the exercise. And as I said, it's about exam tips. It's about preparing for an exam. And as I said, the relationship is between the author who is writing to you in terms of giving you advice about what to do. So if we go through the exercise, when the day comes, give yourself plenty of time, do everything. Just the example here, after plenty of time, we have to use the full infinitive. So we can't just say plenty of time, do everything. Do in this case would just be what we know as the bare infinitive or the naked infinitive, but we need the full infinitive after plenty of time. So the plenty of time to do everything. Have breakfast, but don't drink much. What's this sentence trying to say? The sentence trying to say is don't go crazy with drink. In other words, it's saying avoid drinking. There's no other way to explain this without giving you the answer. Avoid drinking too much. Avoid drinking too much. So we have to use the adverb here, to, which means an excessive amount or too much of something. And that's exactly what this is trying to say here. But so don't drink too much. Go to the toilet, arrive on time, etc., etc., etc. One quick note about vocabulary here. You'll see the language. It says yourself getting more and more nervous while you wait to start. This is a very common language mistake with Polish students because it's a false friend with zdenerwowane in Polish. Zdenerwowane means angry, irritated, whereas nervous in English generally means extremely worried, stressed, a little bit scared, not angry. So very often I hear the mistake, he's a very nervous person. And what they're trying to say is that he's a very angry person. We have to remember that nervous in English means this sense of worried, this sense of being scared, this feeling that you have if you don't know what's going to happen and something important is going to happen. So before an exam, before a bungee jump, before you get married, examples like that. But it doesn't mean angry or irritated, so we have to watch out for that. Now, I said a couple of times already that this is advice to you as the reader of this article, to give you advice. And this is important because if we have a look at the next question, it says, in the exam, calm down by breathing deeply and thinking positively. So we've got a gap between calm down. The question is, who should calm down? What we need here is a subject. We need a subject to the sentence. But because of the structure of the sentence, we have to use a reflexive pronoun in this gap. So we can't say calm you down. This would be a mistake. So you would have to say calm yourself down. And hang on a second, let me just go through the answers. Let me just move this up here. I forgot about this pane. Here we go. So I can write the answers in here. So for gap number 1, it was 2. For gap number 2, it was calm yourself down. So we have to use a reflexive pronoun here. We could, of course, say this in a different way. We could say you must calm down, or you should calm down, or we can use a structure like that. But of course, given with the language that we've got, we have to think of the correct word, and in this case, it's the reflexive pronoun. So calm yourself down by breathing deeply and thinking positively. Read the exam questions carefully, good advice, and underline all of the key instruction words. Indicate how the questions should be answered. What do we need here? Read the exam questions carefully and underline all of the key instruction words. Indicate how the question should be answered. What we need here is a special kind of word which replaces key instruction words. Because if we said underline all of the key instruction words that indicate how the question should be answered, of course that would be too much of a mouthful. So what we need here is a relative pronoun, the correct relative pronoun to refer to key instruction words. And we've got two choices because of the structure of this relative clause. we could say underline all of the key instruction words that indicate, or we could say key instruction words which indicate how the questions should be answered. So for gap number 3, there are 2 possible answers here, that or which. If possible, wonderful. I love conditionals. Conditionals, very, very flexible, very, very useful language structures in English. If possible, start with the ones can do easily to give you confidence. Once again, the thing that's missing from this sentence is the person that we're talking about. And who are we talking about? Well, of course, the article is talking to you. So if possible, start with the ones you can do easily to give you confidence. So one good piece of advice when you're coming to this open-close exercise is to remember the basic active and passive language structures. So the active voice, subject, verb, object, and we've got the passive voice, which is object, verb, plus subject or agent, as it's called in the passive. So if you've got a sentence and we don't know who should be doing something or who is affected by what's happening, then there's a good chance that that might be the answer. And that's what we can see in question number 2 with yourself, and that's what we can see for question number 4. Remember what you've learned from practicing questions and doing mock exams previously, and plan your use of time. Don't panic. Number 5, don't panic. Everyone around you seems to start writing furiously straight away, and don't be tempted to follow their example. What's going on here? Well, the context of the question seems to suggest a hypothetical action that might happen in the future. In this case, a particular hypothetical. In this case, if, I've given you the answer, if everyone else starts to work away and then you don't know what to do when you start to panic. So we need to think of the correct hypothetical word that we can use to introduce a hypothetical. And in this case, we've got 2 possible answers. We can say if. Not a problem. Don't panic if everyone around you seems to start writing furiously. But we're also talking about, or rather the context of this article seems to be suggesting the future, but certainty, something that will happen in the future. And if that's the case, in that particular context, we can also say when. Now, we've got to be careful because if and when are not true synonyms. We can't just swap if and when. If is what I would call a pure hypothetical, so it suggests that it might happen or it might not happen. Whereas when suggests rather that something is going to happen. There's a lot more certainty with when. So when that context is presented, and it's presented in this article, then we can use when. But if that context is not presented, and 2 options might be possible, if something happens or if something doesn't happen, then we can't use when, we would have to use if. Another hypothetical word that we could use is whether, and that's also something that you should think about because whether we normally use with or, so in order to present 2 options, so whether something happens or something else happens. So we've got to remember whether. Here, whether doesn't work because we're not presented with 2 different options. So our answers in this case are if and when. Finally, after the exam, don't join in a discussion about everyone else did. Now, you're probably thinking there are 2 answers here. You're probably thinking what everyone else did, and you're probably thinking how everyone else did. But if you check the answers, you'll see that how is not a correct answer, and you might be scratching your head, and indeed I was, trying to think of a reason why it's not how. And the answer that I came up with, and please let me know if you agree with me or if you disagree with me, please leave a note in the chat or in the comments below once this video is on YouTube. What everyone else did, we need to find a word that talks about results, certain results, or things that happened. Not things that might happen, but things that happened. And the things that happened was that people wrote their answers down on a piece of paper and they know what their answers were. So this was a completed action. If we want to talk about the result, in other words, the exam has been marked and we know what the results of that exam is, well, then we could ask how. How did you do? Did you do well? Did you do badly? Well, that needs to ask how, you need to know the results of the exam. And of course, at this stage, given the context that we've got, at this stage, we don't know what the results are. So we can't say how. At least this is what's going through my mind. As I said, if you disagree with me, please let me know. So here the answer is what, because it refers to an action which is completed, which is certain, and which people can talk about. Not necessarily how. I mean, you might say to me, okay, we could say how to talk about people's feelings, and I could say, okay, fair enough. How did you do? I think I did okay. Maybe you could say that, but I'm not, given this particular context, I'm not 100% persuaded by that argument. But in any case, that's why I think the answer is what and not how. And for number 7, we also have to bear in mind the whole context of the sentence beforehand, or the subclause beforehand. Finally, after the exam, don't join in the discussion about what everyone else did, in other words, what answers they wrote down. You want to frighten yourself. So what this is trying to say is, don't talk to people except if you want to frighten yourself. But of course we can't say, so it's trying to present a kind of negative contrast. But of course we can't say except if, because except if are 2 words and we've only got 1 word. So what word means except if? The answer is, of course, unless. Now I can't move the thing up anymore, so what I'll do is I'll just move that across. Perhaps you can see it better, and I'll move this over towards the side. There we go, you can see it now behind me. Except if, unless you want to frighten yourself and drain your self-confidence for the next exam. And for number 8, above something, comma. Now the comma is important. Above something, comma, remember that exams are not designed to catch you out, but to find out what you know, etc., etc., etc. Why is the comma important? Well, because the comma closes this expression, or this comma closes the set of words before the comma. Now, what we've got here, these 2 words, are what we call a linker. So it links. You might know linkers as discourse markers. Very often in course books they're called discourse markers, or they're called linkers. And what discourse markers do, or what linkers do, or you might know them even as transitions. What they do is that they link the sentence before with, or the sentences before with the sentence that follows. And that's exactly what this expression, which is a linker, is trying to do. And this expression is above all, which means the same as whatever you do, or whatever you think, or whatever you do, depending on the context. So whatever you do, remember that, or whatever you think, remember that exams are not designed to catch you out, etc., etc., etc. Or it might be the most important thing. Could also contextually mean the same as above all. Okay, I hope that my explanations for the FCE question didn't confuse you too much. Cup of tea. And that you managed to follow where I was going and my explanations. If I did lose you along the way, then please write to me, let me know, and I'll be happy to explain in more detail, to give you some references maybe, just to help you understand and to point you in the right direction. Okay, so let's have a look at the CAE question. Now, I hope you managed to have a go at the CAE question. Just because it says CAE doesn't mean it's necessarily harder. Exactly the same rules apply. Exactly the same language issues apply. The answers for the CAE or advanced open-close question, it's the same kind of language traps or the same language areas as in the FCE. So you're looking for the similar kind of things. You're asking yourself the same questions about sentence structure. Are the basics in place? You're recalling conjunctions, subordinate conjunctions, linkers, transitions. You're looking at conditional clauses. You're looking at active and passive, if I didn't say that already. And you're asking yourself the same questions in terms of grammar structure and in terms of sentence structure. Okay, so let's have a look at, and I'll try to explain that as we go through this, that there's nothing particularly difficult about this. The vocab might be a little bit harder, okay, but there's nothing that much more difficult about the CAE question compared to the FCE question. Okay, so we've got the example there. Stress is often called a 21st century illness. First of all, called. What's called? Called is an adjective. I am called Simon, for example, and we introduce adjectives with the verb or a form of the verb be. In this case, is. Stress is called, or stress is often called. This isn't complicated grammar. This is grammar you would have learned back when you started to learn English. My name is Simon. Exactly the same idea. This is crazy. You are crazy, etc., etc. Very simple sentence structures. The grammar doesn't suddenly go all crazy just because it's CAE. Okay, so stress is often called the 21st century illness, but it has always been with us, if perhaps with different names. These days we regard stress a necessary evil of modern living. What do we need in this gap? What we need here is a preposition which explains. So these days we regard stress, and then what follows is an explanation of why we need stress. So if you read the article through, you get the idea of the context that stress is always there, and it causes us different problems. So the explanatory preposition that we need here is as. These days we regard stress as a necessary evil of modern living. Yet stress is not negative, and without what? Without what we would not enjoy some of the high points in life. Without stress, surely. Yet stress is not negative, and without stress, we would not enjoy some of the high points in life. But we can't say stress, because what we're looking here for is functions of language. Although it would be interesting to know if you wrote down stress, whether it would be marked correctly or incorrectly. Different question, different video. But what we need here is a form of substitution. In other words, we need to refer to stress by not calling it stress. So how can we do that? Well, we can refer to stress by calling it it. Yet stress is not negative, and without it, in other words, without stress, so I'll write down it above my head, without it, we would not enjoy some of the high points in life. Now, substitution, for some strange reason, is something that you generally see in textbooks at CAE level, which is a bit strange because substitution is something that you use right from the beginning of when you're learning English. So, for example, him, her, mine, hers, etc., etc. These are all forms of substitution. Instead of saying my brother, my brother, my brother, my brother, my brother, you would say he, and you would think of John even as a form, your brother's name as a form of substitution. You can think of lots of ways to substitute or to replace my brother in simple ways without having to have a great knowledge of English. So, given that we use substitution so early in our learning of English, why it's only taught at advanced levels, I've got absolutely no idea. Because substitution is very, very, very often appears in this open close, and it's something that you've got to watch out for as well. So these days, and without it, we would not enjoy some of the higher points in life. And now, after the gap for number 3, what we get are examples of the high points in life. So the anticipation before a date or the tension leading up to an important match. So what we need here is an expression which means the same as for example, given the structure that we've got. So we've got a gap before as. So what expression means the same as for example? The answer that we need is such. So such as the anticipation before a date. And of course, such as is a form of substitution for example. So synonyms and substitutions very, very closely linked. All these situations produce stress, but gap, you can control it and not the other way around. You will feel stimulated, not worn out. What's our answer? What we've got here in the context of the sentence is a conditional structure. You can control it and not the other way around. Okay, that as a clause stands by itself. And then afterwards, we've got you will feel stimulated, not worn out. Now, because of that additional main clause, you will feel stimulated, not worn out, it makes the clause beforehand sound a little bit strange, because we're trying to communicate what the aim of this sentence here is to try and communicate a conditional of some kind. So what we need for number 4 is a conditional form. And if you remember, we had a conditional form in the FCE exam, in the FCE question as well. So once again, this is not fantastically complicated English. It's just a question of analysing the sentence and understanding what the context is. So which conditional forms can you use here? Well, you've got 2 answers. First of all, you've got the answer which you can use in all hypothetical situations, which is if. What other conditional can we use here? All these situations produce thus, but when you can control it and not the other way around, you will feel stimulated, not worn out. Can we talk about this in terms of future certainty, given the context that we're presented with here? I'm not so sure that's the right way to go, because it rather suggests that something will happen to you, but beforehand we were given examples of things that might happen to you. So if we were to use when in this context, it would it wouldn't fit with the context which is presented beforehand. So when is not the correct answer here. Can we use whether? Well, there's no or in this situation. We're not being presented with 2 options, so we can't say whether. But there is one other that we can use, and that is provided. So provided you can control it. So provide as a collocation works with control. So provided you can control it, not the other way around, you will feel stimulated, not worn out. Worn out meaning tired. However, unlike these situations, and then we've got gap number 5, let me just scroll that up. So, however, unlike these situations, are generally positive and easier to deal with. So, and let's pay attention, as always. If you're eagle-eyed, you'll see that there are 2 commas, one before number 5 and one after with. So these 2 commas have the effect of separating this clause from the main sentence. And if we remember back to areas of grammar which require the use of commas, one area of grammar that uses commas is, of course, relative clauses and relative pronouns. So what we need here is the relative pronoun that refers back to these situations. We've got to say which. So unlike these situations, which are generally positive and easy to deal with, sitting in the train that's running late, da 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 da. So here we have to say which. We can't say that because of the type of relative clause that we're using in this sentence. If you remember, there are 2 types of relative clause. There are, let's see if I can remember now, non-definite or non-defined and defined relative clauses. And if you can't remember the rules for non-defined and defined relative clauses and which ones you can use, in which of those you can use that and which of those you can't use that, then please get onto Google, type in relative clauses, quickly swat up, and there's plenty of resources on the internet for that, and you'll know the difference. And it's important to remember because it's an easy mistake to make. When you're speaking, it doesn't really make that much difference, but when you're writing, it rather stands out if you get that wrong. So for number 6, we have to read the whole sentence with number 5 as well to get an idea of context. However, unlike these situations, which are generally positive and easy to deal with, sitting in the train that's running late, stuck in a traffic jam, or working to a tight deadline are much harder to manage, and so on. What we've got here is a list of things that's going on. So we've got sitting in a train, working to a tight deadline, and stuck in a traffic jam. Now we've got to pay attention to language patterns. And the language pattern that we've got to pay attention to is how each part of that list, so you've got 3 items in that list, how they all begin. And they all begin as gerund forms. So sitting and working. So to fit, the answer for number 6 has got to be also in a gerund form. Now this is an important writing technique that it's important if you're writing in the future in English and you're writing lists and you're writing lists in a way which all of the points of the list at the beginning of those points, if they all agree with each other in terms of case, so if they're all gerunds, if they're all present tense, if they're all future tense, if they begin all with the same preposition, etc., etc. If they all agree, then that makes it a much easier to read and much nicer to read. But when you've got a list which is higgledy-piggledy and you've got lots of different forms of grammar which start each individual point, then that list is a bit of a mess. It's not really good writing. So in this case, in order to fit with this list, we need a gerund form. But a gerund form of what? Stuck is an adjective. Stuck means that you're not moving anywhere. So the verb that we need to introduce adjectives is be. So the answer to this is being stuck in a traffic jam. Now for number 5, let me just write in which. And for number 6, let me type in being. So being stuck in a traffic jam or working to a tight deadline. Moving on to number 7. Stress is now recognized as a medical problem and as a significant factor, then we've got a gap, causing coronary heart disease. What do we need here? We need the correct preposition which collocates with factor. So what's the preposition that we need? And as a significant factor, in. Let me just organize the screen a little bit better so you can see over my shoulder. There we go. So stress is now recognized as a medical problem and as a significant factor, correct preposition, phrasal verb, a factor in causing coronary heart disease. Now this is wonderful advanced language. If you can put this structure in your writing, use it in your speaking, this is wonderful advanced level English. A significant factor in plus gerund. So a significant factor in making something, a significant factor in succeeding in something, a significant factor in being able to meet someone, or whatever it might be. You can come up with a context for lots of different contexts, and it is a wonderful advanced language structure. If we move a little bit further on down, patients are often unwilling to admit to stress problems since they feel they are a form of social failure, and it's important that symptoms identified in order to avoid unnecessary suffering. Now, these kind of questions are always a gift because because these ones are based on understanding simple language patterns. What have we got after the gap? After the gap, we've got identified. Now, identified can be one of two things. It can either be an adjective or it can be the past participle of identify. Well, an adjective doesn't fit here, so that must mean it's the past participle of identify. Now, past participles are used in two language structures. I'm sure you'll remember. The first one is the perfect form. So I have identified. Or the second is in the passive form, where we need a form of the verb be before the past participle. So let's have a look at those. It is important that symptoms have been identified in order to avoid unnecessary sufferings. Doesn't work. We could say it's important that symptoms had been identified. It fits the gap in terms of grammatical sense. Whether that fits the context or not is a different question. So that leaves us with the correct form of the passive voice. It is important that symptoms are identified in order to avoid unnecessary suffering. So we've got simple identification of the passive voice, and that gives us our answer. Thank you very much for watching today. I hope you followed me as I